That's what we just said.
Okay, good afternoon everyone. Let's start. My name is Amir Weiner, Director of the Center for Russian, East European and Eurasian Studies here at Stanford, and it is my pleasure and honor to introduce today's speaker, Professor Daunis Auers, the Jean Monnet Chair for European Studies at the University of Latvia in Riga. Professor Daunis is well known, not only in the Baltics, but everywhere for his studies of comparative government and politics in the region, including the populism and radical right in these three countries, and of course his masterful book on comparative government and politics in the region from 2015, that is a must read for any student of the region and modern European politics. Nowadays he started a new project on the Baltic-Nordic integration, but today we asked him, invited him to speak to us about the Baltic region and the impact of the current Russian invasion of Ukraine, the international and domestic consequences and developments, and you are most welcome here. Pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Amir, for your very kind and very generous words, and thank you for the invitation to come here. Now, I always feel like I should start out explaining something about my accent. So, I was born in the UK to in a Latvian family, though my mother is German, father Latvian. And I grew up in a small town in the middle of England, absolutely dominated by Scots. And so I grew up with a Scottish accent until I was 12 or 13. And then I moved towards having a sort of general British accent. Then I moved to Latvia in 1993. So over the last 30 years, I've added a sort of Nordic, Baltic, East European twang. And just to make things worse, my wife is from New Jersey. So I have a little bit of that thrown in as well. So perhaps that explains why, as one of my students once told me, I sound a little bit like a Baltic Mick Jagger when I'm speaking, which as I understood it was not intended as a compliment. So yeah, I'm here to talk about the impact of the war in Ukraine. And of course the war has had a profound effect on the Baltic states and on the Nordic, Baltic, Central and East European region. And we could have a whole course on this. But I'm going to try to narrow it down to speaking initially about the international effects of the war. And this is the part, I think, which is quite well known, quite well written about. Certainly our three ambassadors from the Baltic states frequently talk about these international effects, as do the international relations scholars, the security scholars, who are really the most visible speakers, for obvious reasons, about the war in Ukraine. But as a comparative political scientist, my own personal interest is in the domestic political systems, about what's going on inside the Baltic states. So having covered this sort of international effects part, I want to turn to the domestic changes which are taking place. So let's start then with these international effects. Now, the first thing to note is that the shock of the Russian invasion of Ukraine was more muted this time around. Russia's invasion of Crimea in 2014 was genuinely shocking to people. And at that time, there was quite a lot of discussion about, well, what do we do if it happens here? Do we go to the forest, right? How do we get to the American embassy? You know, should we leave now? That kind of rhetoric was quite widely established because of the shock of 2014. But by the time of 2022, the reaction was a little bit different. It wasn't one of defensiveness, of defeat, of moving abroad or something like that. It was, well, this is what we expected, and we're sort of ready for it. And in the following months, as the Russian military imploded, collapsed, was shown to be an absolutely inadequate force, there was a growing sense of confidence in the future of the Baltic states. That the fate that befell Ukraine could not and would not affect our region. So this was quite a striking difference. The conflict also very much pushed the Baltic states together. Now, a couple of days ago, I received a draft of a book project some colleagues and I had started before the pandemic, and then we had all collectively forgotten about it, except for one brave fellow in Luxembourg who renewed the book project and was sending proofs of the chapters. And I hadn't looked at these proofs for 3 or 4 years. But this was a chapter about Baltic cooperation. And I started out by pointing out that the Baltic states don't really like each other very much on a day-to-day basis. They don't really cooperate with each other. And I took a quote from the Lithuanian Prime Minister at that time, Prime Minister Skvernelis, who said, and he was criticized for this afterwards, but I think it reflects a certain attitude in the Baltic states. He said, and I quote, "The Latvians are not our brothers, they are our rivals." And this is the sort of rhetoric we've often heard. There's a very famous speech from somebody who spent a few years here in Stanford, President Ilves of Lithuania, where in 1999 he also talked about the Baltic states and Balticness not actually existing, about it being a construct, about Lithuania being Central European, about Estonia being a Nordic country, and Latvia just something in the middle, something unclear. So, generally speaking, there's no love lost really between the Baltic states. But when there's a time of crisis, such as the escape from the Soviet Union, shall we say, in the late 1980s, or previously, the pandemic, and now, of course, war and conflict in Ukraine, then the Baltics do come together. And we've seen a real substantive increase in government, in civil society, a real sort of sense of Balticness re-emerging. Whether it holds after the crisis, I don't know. It didn't hold after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But that's a time where people fell into social crisis, economic crisis, you know, everything changed in life. And there was a real sense of crisis everywhere. I don't think we're going to have that same kind of feeling when this conflict ends. And perhaps there is some greater basis for Baltic cooperation. But by the way, I also like this picture because, I mean, the standard joke is that this is not the worst boy band ever put together. But that this, of course, is the president of Ukraine in the middle, with the president of Poland to his left. And then we have a sort of cliched version of the 3 Baltic states. We have, of course, the Estonian, who has to advertise Estonian, right? Because you can't go anywhere. You can't miss a photo opportunity, not to remind people that it's Estonia. Then we have the Lithuanian president over there on the far right, dressed, I think, a little inappropriately. I don't think we should be wearing skinny shirts at that kind of age. And dressed a little bit like he's going to a nightclub. And then we have the Latvian president, who in his heart is always a teacher and dresses like one as well. So we see a real difference between the presidents. But there have been lots of photo opportunities like this because there's been a lot of cooperation between the 3 Baltic states. The Baltic states have also, of course, led the way in spending. Now, of course, in absolute numbers, America has contributed more than any other country. But as a percentage of gross domestic product, America would have to spend about 4 times more, so astronomical sums of money, to catch up with Latvia and Estonia. And of course, for Latvia and Estonia, this money is probably more meaningful than it is to the American federal budget. Our countries are still middle-income countries, still trying to escape the middle-income track and reach high-income status. So this is a real sacrifice from the Baltic states. You know, in the case of Latvia, if we're talking about 1% of GDP, that's what, about 600-700 million euros. That's money that could have been invested in upgrading our higher education system, improving our medical care, and so on, which in a small country of 1.8 million people, that kind of money would actually make a difference. But instead, it's been unhesitatingly and supported across the board, by society, by politicians of all stripes, it's gone to support Ukraine. And so the Baltic states are really leaders when it comes to this category, and they should probably be applauded. It will have an economic impact, of course. It will have an economic impact. Growth has slowed down well below the previous predictions that were made, and is likely to be sluggish, of course. Foreign investors are very, very wary about investing in the Baltic region because basically they receive bad political risk advice. But there's no doubt that some kind of impact has been felt by the Baltic states, and this will resonate for some years, and probably also into the future, because of course Ukraine has been guaranteed a place in the European Union eventually, and before it gains full membership, it will probably gain membership to European Union funds. And European Union funds are terribly important to the Baltic states. It's basically the only free money that we have. It's the only money which is used for capital investments, roads, bridges. It's money which is made available to upgrading education systems, building new wings in hospital, training doctors, and so on. And quite frankly, when Ukraine joins the EU, we might lose a lot of that money, if not all of it, because the cost of rebuilding Ukraine will be so huge. But I'll return to this issue in just a few more slides. Then, of course, we have the impact on NATO. And here we see that with Finland joining very recently, we're very, very close to the Baltic Sea becoming a NATO lake. I have no special information on Sweden, but those who do are extremely confident that Sweden will be joining, regardless of what happens in the Turkish presidential election rerun soon, but Sweden will be joining as well, and perhaps sooner than we had expected. And then when that takes place, then Baltic security from sort of macro perspective is strengthened quite considerably. And in contrast, as you can see, which will be another problem, Russian security is weakened, because as we can see, then we have just a couple of spits here around St. Petersburg, and then the what is still just about known as the Kaliningrad exclave also there. But from the Baltic states' perspective, of course, this strengthens our security, because up until Poland and Finland joining, we only had this very, very narrow gap joining the Baltics to Western Europe, the Suwalki Gap, which was seen as a strategic weakness, and now the Baltic Sea essentially becomes a Baltic Lake, and this strengthens the macro security. And of course, NATO's eastern flank has been strengthened quite significantly, especially with troop numbers, which seem to be rising over time. The trend is for growth to take place. Ideally, the Balts want to have a division of about 15,000 soldiers based in each Baltic state, which would bring up the military presence to about 50,000. Now, we're quite some way in several years from that, but as you can see, the numbers of NATO troops in the Baltic states have grown quite considerably. They are there, of course, as a trigger primarily, rather than a fighting force, but over time the Balts hope that they will also develop into a very powerful, flexible fighting force. Investments are taking place in new military infrastructure, barracks for troops, bases for helicopters, runways for planes, and we're seeing a lot of capital investment in the security sphere in these three Baltic states. Now, this may well lead to some problems in the future, because the spending has gone through the roof. And we've had a few procurement scandals come up in the Baltic states. I think the biggest one hitherto was in Latvia for food procurement for the troops, with some dodgy contracts, and there might well be other contracts to come, because the spending has risen so quickly. There's been political pressure to mostly direct that to companies and firms and enterprises based in the Baltic states. And with that kind of increase in spending, which hasn't perhaps been controlled as well as it should have been, there might well be some scandals to come. It's not only about Russia, it's also about China. China's weakness, or rather China's presence in the Baltic states has also been considerably weakened. So there was an institution known as the 16+1, which then became the 17+1, then became the 16+1, and is now the 14+1. This was an attempt by China to bring leverage to Europe. So basically, China peeled away a number of European Union member states, including the 3 Baltic states and Poland, hooked them up with a couple of non-member states, which are here in that sort of pinky color rather than the deep red, and created a forum to negotiate with these countries. And there were promises that investment would come as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So railways, ports, so there'd be much more goods flowing through them, creating jobs and so on. Well, that hasn't really taken place, certainly not in the Baltic states. I can remember one rather sad-looking train a couple of years ago turning up from China, which apparently was empty, so the conspiracy theory went, as the first of some kind of new rail route, a new Silk Road from China to Northern Europe. Investment has been extremely low, if not non-existent, in the Baltic states. Most investments have been private property, simply Chinese investors buying residency rights by purchasing property or shares in companies in primarily Latvia. And that's made it a little bit easier for the Baltic states to leave this organization. So Lithuania was the first to go, followed by Estonia and Latvia last year. And it's being replaced by something that looks very, very similar, but it's in a green color, all right? So that's difference number 1. And difference number 2 is that this is an Atlanticist version of the 16+1. So the 3 Cs initiative is a very similar aim to the 16+1. It's to promote investment in infrastructure in those countries colored in green. It's supported by the USA, very, very, very significantly, also by the United Kingdom, and rather more reluctantly by other European Union member states. And the idea is to create an investment fund where states, municipalities, private businesses can apply for very cheap loans in order to upgrade, develop infrastructure. But basically, as you can see, the idea is to create an explicit replacement for the Belt and Road Initiative, which is Western oriented, which doesn't split the European Union, and which keeps the USA closely involved. And that's very much what we have here. The 3 Cs initiative is still in the very, very early stages of development, shall we say. It isn't institutionalized. There are some countries which absolutely don't want to have a permanent secretariat or something like that. That would be Hungary, by the way. But others really see this as a way of swiftly and competitively upgrading infrastructure all across this Central European region from the north to the south. And another change is perhaps in our regional coalitions. So within the European Union, voting is very, very complicated. But these days, most votes in the Council of Ministers, where the member states sit. So the Council of Ministers is kind of like the US Senate, where every state has 2 representatives, and this is where countries are represented. It's essentially, it's kind of like a higher level of the European Parliament, the second tier. Now, voting here is based on size, how many citizens you have. So the Baltic states, which are among the smaller countries in the EU, altogether have 1.35% of the European Union population. Okay? In order to pass legislation in this upper house, you need what's called a double majority. You need to have 65% of the population agreeing. Okay, votes are only 1.35. But On the other hand, you also need 55% of European Union states agree. So that's 14 of 27, of which the Balts are 3. So in order to sort of try to multiply your influence, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are together with the Nordic states in the map that we can see there to the right. And this is known as the NB6 format. The Nordic Baltics, they meet before every significant meeting of the European Council or the Council of Ministers. They coordinate their positions in order to have greater leverage. Primarily, not because of the population, because together with the Nordics, the Nordic Baltic region is still 6.23% of the population, so well below the 65% needed for legislation, but they're almost a quarter of the countries, right? They are 6 of 27. And the Balts have been doing this for a long time. However, over the course of the last year, the Baltic states have cozied up to the Visegrad states minus Hungary, for obvious reasons, because Hungary is sort of dragging its heels on being supportive of Ukraine. And to my mind, this sort of indicates perhaps a longer-term shift that might be taking place. Because in truth, we have very little in common with the Nordic countries, right? The basic issue in the EU is about money. The Baltics, we want more of it. The Nordics, they want to give less. Because we are recipients and they are, we're beneficiaries and they contribute to the EU budget, they're net contributors. So in actual fact, on this core issue, which is more money for development, the Nordics and the Baltics, they differ. And also on certain value issues, there's also quite a big difference. The Baltics are less enthusiastic about the green development issue than the Nordics are. But when it comes to Central and Eastern Europe, we're actually on the same page with all these things. The Visegrad 4 countries, who also cooperate on an institutionalized basis, they also want more money from the EU, right? They want to squeeze the German taxpayer and the Swedish taxpayer. So we're on the same page as them. They're also a little bit more conservative, they're a little bit more skeptical about green issues, and they actually make more, let's say, normal partners for the Baltic states, because our interests coincide. However, the reason why this hasn't taken place over time, it's been told to me several times by diplomats at different times, basically the Baltics see themselves as wanting to be like the Nordics. It's an aspirational thing. This is where we want to go, and the Visegrad, I mean, you know, who wants to be like Orban these days? No, not many. So this is an issue, but I think that we're seeing some change here, and this would be quite a notable change. And by the way, a putative NB, or rather VB7, Visegrad Baltic 7, would have much more clout than the NB6, because then we're talking about 15.5% of the European population and more than a quarter of countries, 7 of 27. So this is a change that will take place slowly. Perhaps it will never be realized, but as long as we continue, especially to work very, very closely with Poland on many issues, and remember in the picture, Polish president, he was there with the 3 Baltic ones, well, then I see perhaps some change taking place here. Okay, so those are the international effects. What about the domestic effects? Well, to understand the domestic effects, I would take us back to the late 1980s and the early 1990s, when there was the so-called 3D idea, which was very well established in Estonia and in Latvia, and to a lesser extent in Lithuania, because Lithuania had far less migration from Russia and Russian-speaking countries in the Soviet era. So the 3Ds were a nativist vision of what the Baltic states should do, how they should develop in the future. And it's still kept alive, or it was kept alive by some radical forces in each country. So this is a screenshot that I've taken from a newspaper called A Latvian in Latvia, Latviets Latvia, which is published by the Latvian National Front, a extremist organization, still published to this day. You can still buy it if you want, take out a subscription. And as you can see, the newspaper is called the 3Ds, and these 3Ds are deoccupation, decolonization, and de-Bolshevization. And broadly speaking, the idea was a de-Russification, if you like, of the Baltic states, to emphasize national cultures over Russian or Soviet cultures, to emphasize the supremacy of the Baltic languages within the Baltic states over other languages, to support national cultures, and to sort of get rid of the relics of the Soviet regime. And these ideas were very, very popular in the time. They were kept alive in the late 90s, 2000s, and so on by radical or other extremist organizations. But they were very popular in the 1980s, in the early 1990s, and they have returned to the Baltic states over the last 12 months as well, since the war in Ukraine. Now, why did the 3Ds disappear? Before we go to talking about how it's realized today, we should ponder why it didn't strengthen. Well, really, it's because of international conditionality. The international organizations and the aspiration to join these international organizations in order to strengthen Baltic security. So to get into NATO, to get into the European Union and have access to the European Union market. All these ambitions meant that we had to listen to the advice coming from experts from these organizations who basically said no, 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 no to most of these aspirations to do with the school system, to do with citizenship, to do with language, residency, and so on. And also the Nordic states, who were also heavily invested and involved in the Baltic reforms in the 1990s and the early 2000s, particularly actually in the early 2000s to help the Baltic states get ready for EU membership. They were also very, very critical of these kind of nativist aspirations. So over time, these aspirations, they disappeared. We had the economic growth in the Baltic states in the early 2000s, which was then followed by the economic collapse in 2008, 2009, depopulation that followed this, the pandemic and all these other things. Basically, other things were going on. And in the Baltic states, citizens, although perhaps these are ethnic Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians, perhaps may be unhappy with the extent of Russian influence in the Baltic states, they kind of got used to it over time. And there were a couple of political parties, a couple of deputies in parliament who would push for these kind of policies, would remind voters about them, but these forces were relatively small, on average less than 10% of parliamentary deputies. So the mainstream ruled. And so these ambitions, they disappeared. But over the last 12 to 14 months, we've seen them not just reappear, but to a large extent be realized, be enacted. So the first thing to comment is the school system. Now, in Estonia and Latvia, a relic of the Soviet era was a dual educational system. Schools which taught in Russian, having one stream, and schools that taught in Estonian and Lithuanian in another stream. And although these minority schools have shrunk over time, in the previous school year, still 28%, so almost a third of school children in Latvia studied in a minority school. Now, minority school, there's also a Ukrainian school, there's also a Polish school, but overwhelmingly we're talking about Russian-speaking educational institutions here. Now, there are all kinds of negative effects from the dual system. One is that pupils in these schools didn't learn the national languages very well because of a shortage of teachers. Because public education is in Estonian and in Latvian in these two countries, this meant that these students had much more difficult access to state-funded free public education and very often went to private schools, Russian-speaking schools, which were, quite frankly, of very, very shoddy, questionable quality, to put it mildly. So they were sort of, pushed into this sphere. And there is also the social cost of having these parallel systems around. So I felt this most often when having to take my son to his sporting classes, which is, of course, the most terrible thing about being a parent is having to express interest in their, sporting stuff. So my son trained in a Latvian football team, one of the rare Latvian-speaking football teams in Riga. And whenever they would have a game against a Russian-speaking side, and there were no sort of schools which cut across this ethnic divide, right? Essentially either you're one or the other, there would be some quite saucy language, shall we say, used on both sides. And my son somehow, I'm not exactly sure how, but somehow got a black belt in karate as well. And on the rare occasions where we had some of these karate things, then exactly the same thing would come out as well. And this seems to be partly because people were living parallel lives. Maybe in the workplace there was some commonality, but at home, the media you consume, the news that you consume, how you spend your free time, these were very, very different. Essentially, we had a very segregated system, education system and social system in Estonia and Latvia. Russians make up about 5% of the population in Lithuania. Poles are a larger minority at about 6.7%. So, the school system was protected largely because of these international experts, international organizations, and then also Russia. Let's say some kind of undefined worry about what Russia would do if changes were to take place. All these fears disappeared over the last 12 months. And Latvia is completing a transition, which has been put off for 30 years, over a 2-year period. So by 2025, Latvia will switch to full education in the Latvian language. There will be a shortage of teachers, there will be a shortage of textbooks. Won't be an easy thing to do, but the political decision has been made. We are getting rid of Russian-speaking minority schooling. Estonia is doing this rather more slowly as a staged process, which will end in 2033, when the schools fully switch over to only teaching in Estonian. And Estonia has been a little bit more forward-looking in actually constructing new high schools. So Narva, for example, will be getting 2 new build schools. And the idea is that in these places, Estonians and Russians can come without preconceptions, without having, the history of being in this particular school that was a Russian-speaking school, or school number 3 that was a Latvian one. But a new school is a sort of fresh beginning. And we haven't quite gotten to these kind of detailed discussions in Latvia. But the decision has been made. And so what we see here in the slide is the organization, the Russian School Defense Headquarters, known as the Stabs in Latvia, which for the last 20 years has defended Russian schools, organized demonstrations whenever there's been some kind of slight education reform, pushing Russian-speaking schools to have more Latvian in their curriculum and so on, and they've simply lost all credibility, all salience in the last year, and these laws were passed with very, very little opposition. Certainly very little opposition on the streets, and probably even less in Parliament. So this long-held ambition has been achieved. Alongside it, also big changes in language and the use of Russian. So we've already talked about the eradication of Russian schooling system. But there's also a push to try to get rid of teaching Russian as a second or a third language. So in Latvia, the plan is that English will be the standard second language, which is already the case de facto at the moment. But then the next language must be a European Union language. And then you can, if you want to learn a 4th language, you can do Russian or something if you want. But very much is trying to push people, let's say, in a European direction. In Lithuania, where Russian is very popular, actually, as a second language to Lithuanian students. The government is pushing to move towards Polish as the standard second language for obvious geographic reasons. Again, there's a problem with teachers, there's a problem with textbooks, but there's a political commitment to move away from teaching Russian. And all three countries are also redeveloping their language laws, especially in Estonia and Latvia. So in Estonia, for example, there will be the renewal of taxi drivers and other people working in the service sector having to be able to prove their language competency by taking a centralized European text. The reason why I have there is a reason to the pictures on the slides. The reason we have this one here is because in Latvia there's been a switch in driving tests. Driving tests can now only be taken in Latvian, not in Russian. And there was an article in the newspapers last week that somebody had tried to bribe a driving instructor to let them take the lesson in Russian with a €10 bribe. That's not going to get you very far. It was reported, found guilty, suspended sentence. But so even on these kind of areas, I mean, we've seen public websites in Latvia and Estonia slowly take away their Russian parts. The president did it for his website, but it's also taking place in institutions or agencies which have a public function. So, you know, if you take away, for instance, information about health regulations, access to doctors and things like that, if you take that away in Russian and it's only available in Latvian, that will of course hit people, especially older people, who older Russian speakers who don't have Latvian language skills. But these are the kind of debates which are taking place. There's a law passed also that job advertisements cannot state that you need to speak Russian in order to have that position. In Lithuania, there's been discussion about advertisements, that advertisements in shopping centres have to be in the Lithuanian language. There's been the same discussion in Estonian as well. That you can only have a little bit, like, you know, Coca-Cola followed by the logo in Lithuanian or Estonian or something like this. And these discussions are continuing. Basically, the Russian language is being squeezed out of the public sphere. Latvia, there are discussions on a new election law, and in that election law, what's called agitation. So the pre-election period, when you're meeting with voters and so on, this is only allowed to take place in Latvian. So when you're organizing a public meeting, it must be in Latvian. One-to-one discussions, of course, those can still be in Russian, but if you're having an organized meeting, it has to take place in Latvian, advertisements have to be in Latvian, not Cyrillic font can't be used, and so on. And the most recent thing is Kaliningrad, of course. Kaliningrad, this little interesting area. For a couple of years I had to work in Kaliningrad. I was very, very unhappy about it. So I have a negative connotation. I didn't live there, but I had to travel there frequently from Latvia. On one occasion, a elderly lady tried to make me smuggle a live chicken, over the border on the bus we were in, a delightfully named town called Sovietsk in Kaliningrad. I didn't do it. I had my principles. That chicken remained in Lithuania. But yeah, Kaliningrad is being renamed now. So Lithuania has renamed it in all official discourse. It's Karaliaučius. It's close enough. Do we have any Lithuanian speakers? Yeah. Oh no. How did I do?
You did very well.
Okay, that's what I like to hear. Thank you so much. And in Latvia also, it can be known as Karalauči or by the historic German name of Königsberg, but no more Kaliningrad. Estonia, I am sure, will eventually move to have this kind of legislation as well. It hasn't done it now, but we can see that the Baltic states really move in tandem on these issues, with one leading, another following, a little bit like the Popular Fronts in the 1980s. So, big changes afoot with Russian being squeezed from the public space. And then, of course, we have, I mean, this isn't really just about monuments, it's about culture and monuments and historical memory. So, in 2007, when the bronze soldier was taken down in Tallinn. We had one of the very rare moments of public disorder in the Baltic states, when Russian-speaking Estonians went onto the streets and protested, and there were a couple of days of small-scale riots. In August this year, the towering Victory Monument, as it's known in Latvia, which was built in the 1980s, but people have the feeling that it's been there forever. It's this huge monument to Soviet victory in the Second World War, which was, so the river Daugava cuts Riga in two. And on one side, we had the Latvian Freedom Monument from the interwar period, and almost exactly opposite it, on the other side of the river, we had this Victory Monument. And this has been a sore issue for years. Nationalists have been saying it needs to be pulled down. Why aren't we doing it? Diplomats say we can't. It's part of a withdrawal treaty that we had with Russian troops leaving Latvia, that we wouldn't touch these wartime things. Even after the invasion, politicians were very wary about this. And then, on the 9th of May last year, despite celebration, so 9th of May is Victory Day for the Soviet Army, widely celebrated in Russia. It's become sort of Putin's big event, annual event. There were disturbances by the monument. There were people going there in Russian uniforms, wearing Russian symbols, which have been banned in Russia, such as the St. George's ribbon and Soviet-era hammer and sickles and things like that. And police didn't really cope with it very well. And a couple of days later, quickly Parliament passed a law saying, look, we're just going to get rid of these things, so we stopped being rallying points. And hundreds of Soviet-era memorials, monuments, and so on have been pulled down over the course of the last year in all three Baltic states. Some of them big, like this monument here, and it's one of those things, many Latvians can tell you where they were when they found out that it was being pulled down, because it was a live event on TV in August last year. But also smaller ones in smaller rural cities, towns, and so on, which have also been removed. So we have this kind of like removal of the physical evidence of the Soviet era, something which, of course, de-Sovietization was all about. We have the renaming of things. So in Tartu, there's a bridge which was built in 1965, which was known as the Victory Bridge, right? Again, as a memorial to victory in the Second World War. By the way, they never mentioned the role of the Americans, in the Second World War. It's all about the Russian commitment. And this bridge was renamed the Peace Bridge. And then, of course, we have all kinds of streets which have been renamed. And the closer to the Russian embassy, the better. So in Lithuania, the street where the Russian embassy was renamed the Ukrainian Heroes Street. In Latvia, the Russian embassy street was renamed Independent Ukraine Street, and so on. Laws have been passed banning the ribbon of St. George, the V symbol, the Z symbol. Streets have been renamed. So if there are Russian era or Soviet era military people who have streets named after them, well, those streets are going to be renamed. In Riga, for example, the General, oh dear, my handwriting's terrible. Okay, the General B, let's leave it at that, street in Riga was renamed the Annas Brigadera Street after a beloved Latvian author. There was a street named after a Russian-Polish mathematician, scientist, Keldisha Iela, and that was renamed the Brāju Kaudzi Iela, again after Latvian authors. Many operas, theatres, and so on have taken it upon themselves to not show works by Russian authors. Lithuania's opera theatre has removed any work by Russian composers, doesn't intend to take those in the future. And basically Russian culture, physical monuments, and so on are slowly being removed. And now we're getting to the stage where we have monuments to writers, to poets like Pushkin, and then the question is, well, what do we do with these? Do we relocate them away from very prominent places, or do we keep them there as part of the history of these cities and towns and so on? And these discussions will be ongoing, but certainly the momentum is there for this very visible, first of all, de-Sovietization, but coming after that, a de-Russification, again, of the public sphere. And then we also have residency issues, so the right to live in the Baltic states, which was a keystone issue for nationalist forces in the 1980s, the 1990s, right? The idea that Russian speakers who had settled in the interwar period should return to the places whence they came. But of course, this was nixed by international organizations and so on. Well, there is a gradual and gentle return to these issues. So, first of all, the Baltic states banned real estate purchases by Russian speakers, Russian citizens almost immediately after the war, stopped issuing visas, halted residency permits, universities stopped enrolling students from Russia and Belarus. And there have been cases where residents, permanent residents, but not citizens of the Baltic states have been not allowed, rather than being deported, but not being allowed to return. So in Narva, there was one case where a 66-year-old Russian speaker, decked out in a Russian military uniform, with a flag, a Russian flag wrapped around him and other symbols, went across the Narva bridge to the town on the other side to take part in a pro-war demonstration. But he walked back and was surprised that the Estonian border guards wouldn't let him in, that they had revoked his residency permit. And so then he had to turn around and is making a new life for himself in Russia. And there are other cases like this in the Baltic states. And in Latvia, Russian citizens, so Russian citizens who are resident in Latvia but have taken out Russian citizenship, and that's what this picture is taken from, have to take a language test. So we're back to language. They have to prove, those who are under 75, have to prove competency in the Latvian language. There's about 20,000 people who have to take this test. They have to take it by November this year, and pass it by November this year. And it looks like many people won't. Hitherto, 5,000 people have taken the test. Half of them failed. So that's about 10% or so. Well, then Latvia is clearly going to have this issue at the end of the year, what they do with these Russian citizens who have failed this qualifying language test. Because, of course, the optics, we're mostly talking about older generation people, not exclusively, but mostly about older generation people, and the optics of removing en masse 70-year-olds to the border would probably not be great. And that's why one political party, Saskia Harmony, is, for example, helping these citizens. It's a party which appeals to the Russian-speaking electorate in Latvia to try to pass the exams, to deal with all the administration, the legalities, and all these other things for this. And another incident was, of course, TV Rain, which was an opposition media in Russia, which relocated to Latvia. And many journalists, about 200 Russian journalists from about 23 different independent media relocated to Latvia in the aftermath of the war. But TV Rain was the only one to register as resident in Latvia and thus come under the Latvian regulator. And it quickly fell afoul, just a couple of months. It didn't follow the law on producing Latvian language translation for its material repeatedly. It then made this even worse by turning up for a meeting with a regulator, but not bringing a translator, assuming that they could have a meeting with a regulator in the Russian language, because they didn't speak English either. So that, of course, made the situation a little bit worse. And then they also had presenters who would make slips on air and refer to the Russian army as our army or our boys in winter and so on. And in December last year, eventually the license was revoked and TV Rain is relocated to the Netherlands in the European Union. And so these kind of things are taking place as well. Latvia, as well as Estonia and Lithuania, are making it clear that they are not a comfortable place for Russian speakers. If the Russian opposition wants to sort of move there, they can, but they should sort of learn the language as we've established, the culture, the norms, and so on. And also when Putin announced the general mobilization, all three Baltic states were quick to say, well, we're not going to take runaways here. If you're running from the Russian army, don't come here, go to Georgia or somewhere, but we won't accept that as a reason for seeking refugee status. So, this then, I think, quite convincingly shows us that the 3Ds have returned, and they have been enacted over a very short period of time. And then, of course, we have to ask, well, why is this so? And I would say that there are a number of long-term and short-term factors for this turn in events. In the long term, radical right, as opposed to extreme right. So when we talk about the far right, there are two groups. The extreme right are those who want to get rid of the current order, right? Get rid of the constitution, get rid of the system, and introduce some kind of hardcore, new, frequently authoritarian regime. The radical right are nativist. The radical right are happy with democracy. They don't intend to making any changes there. They have an issue with liberal democracy, with individual rights, gay rights, gender issues, and so on. And also nationalism issues, nativist issues. And in the Baltic states, relatively right-wing nativist ideas over the last 30 years have become mainstream, to the extent that perhaps people don't even notice that they have become normalized. But we find that the center of Latvian and Estonian and Lithuanian politics, but especially Latvian and Estonian, is a little bit to the right of the center of politics that we find in other European countries, although other European countries are very much catching up. In the Nordic states, for example, we've seen quite a significant shift to the right over the last 10 or 15 years, and perhaps the Baltic center soon will also be the European center. But we have a mainstreaming of radical right nativism, and accompanied by this, it's just a fact that over the last 30 years, Russian-speaking minorities were not integrated into Estonia and Latvia. Parallel lives that I've already outlined, certain areas, certain cities, certain blockhouse regions, which were known as sort of Russian-speaking regions and so on. We haven't really had a coming together of these communities, largely because, of course, young people have been learning in separate schools and growing up in separate streams. So this is a very visible failure, shall we say, of Baltic politics over the last 30 years, and this is an attempt to fix it for the next 30. And then, of course, we have some short-term factors as well. You have the Russian atrocities in Ukraine, which means that domestic opposition doesn't exist. Russian-speaking political parties, NGOs, and so on don't support Putin. There are, of course, some organizations which do, undercover and so on, but the mainstream ones don't. The biggest Russian-speaking party, most successful party in Latvia over the last 20 years is Harmony Social Democracy. And they quickly came out to denounce Putin, denounce the Russian war, be on the side of Ukraine, and so on. So much of the opposition to undertaking these kind of reforms simply doesn't exist anymore. There are also significant changes in the international environment. Latvia is now a member of the EU. It's a member of NATO, which has been telling both these organizations, see, we told you the Russians would do this. Why wouldn't you listen to us? And there isn't really that type of leverage that there was in the 1990s for international institutions to somehow criticize the Baltics on this. Some NGOs do. Amnesty International, for instance, has been quite outspoken. But really, the leverage isn't there. The voice isn't there. And at the same time, the Baltic states are much more confident than they were in the 1990s. You can see this in the political systems. right? In the early 1990s, Baltic politics was crazy. It's crazy stuff, right? All kinds of new parties, like they would appear, they would disappear, right? Politicians jumping from one thing to another. Governments that lasted 6 months to be replaced by another one. Look at it now. The stability is tremendous. Lithuania will have had only 2 prime ministers over the last 8 years. And the prime ministers serve a full cycle between elections. In Latvia, Krišjānis Kariņš, an American Latvian, has been prime minister for a record-breaking 5 years now. And over the last 10 years, I think there have only been, if I remember correctly, 3 prime ministers. We used to have 3 prime ministers in a year. Now it's the UK that has 3 prime ministers in a year, literally, right? And remember Sweden, a year and a half ago, they had a prime minister who was in office for an afternoon, right? So the Baltic states are actually paradigms of democratic consolidation. And over the last 10 years, our democratic rankings, the points issued by Freedom House and so on, have been improving. While elsewhere, including the European Union and America and so on, they've been sliding down. So we're aware of this. Yes, the Baltic states are a little bit poorer than Western Europe and Northern Europe, but they no longer feel like they're sort of, apprentices, learning about the market economy and so on. But we have a great deal of confidence. I mean, next year we will have been in the European Union for 20 years. And the same goes for NATO, of course. So this political confidence means that domestic decisions can be taken now that haven't in the past. Now I know that for some people these things might seem like kind of tough. So I just want to finish on something that's a positive. And I think that, if we're very optimistic, we might be seeing a rebirth of civil society in the Baltic states. Because for the last 30 years, one very much researched issue is the relatively low levels of social capital in Lithuania and Latvia, especially a little bit less so in Estonia, but still an issue there. A relatively passive civil society. I mean, over the last 30 years, do you know how many riots we've had in Latvia? Does anybody want to make a guess?
5.
1. 1 riot in 30 years, right? I mean, they have more than that in Stockholm every week now, right? 1 riot, and that was a pretty forlorn one. I blundered into it by accident. I was in the Old Town at an event. I was crossing it to go meet some other people, and all of a sudden I was in the middle of this riot. And it was pretty half-hearted compared to my student days in London, I have to say. About 100 heavily inebriated young people who were mostly trying to steal alcohol and cigarettes from a Latvi's Balsams shop there. And that's it, in terms of major disorder. Similar case in Lithuania and Estonia. And this sort of hints at relatively low levels of apathy. We've had sort of shrinking turnout in elections. We have, in Latvia at least, the smallest political parties in Europe, because only 1% of the adult population who are citizens have joined political parties. The average is 5% in Europe, and so on. But just a few days after the Russian invasion, we had the biggest public demonstrations, and this is one from Tallinn, in support of Ukraine. The biggest rallies, tens of thousands of Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians taking to the streets in support of Ukraine. We had this opening up of hearts and of wallets, houses, people opening up their apartments, their houses, to take on refugees, donating their time, donating their money, in all kinds of interesting ways. One guy has created something in Latvia called the Twitter Convoy. And the Twitter Convoy is basically a way to get people to donate used 4x4s, so SUVs, which can be used by the Ukrainian military. And this guy, basically on his own, with a couple of people helping him and using Twitter as his communication, has transferred more than 1,000 SUVs to Ukraine. And by the way, Latvia also passed a law that drink drivers, when you're over a certain blood level of alcohol, you now have your car taken away from you And if that car is an SUV, it also gets donated to Ukraine. and rather heartwarmingly, about 3 weeks ago, somebody was driving in their, from what I gather, month-old Porsche Cayenne SUV. They were stopped, blood level, and that Porsche Cayenne is now on its way to the front line in Russia. Sorry, in the Russian-Ukrainian war. But so there is this, people are really, really committed to helping Ukraine, to donating money, to donating their time in all kinds of different ways. And perhaps this signals sort of a return to the civic values that we had in the late 1980s and in the early 1990s before the economic and social crisis, which was so devastating at that time, overtook us. And so on that positive note, and having spoken for a little bit longer than I promised, my apologies, Amir, thank you so much, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, and we're open for questions.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful talk. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the Ukrainian refugees in Estonia and the other two countries, and how they interface with the Russian speakers who have lived in the countries for generations. And because I understand that there's like a real enthusiasm to learn Estonian, Latvian, and there isn't that kind of barrier that has existed between the Russian populations and the Baltic populations.
Yeah, there's an enthusiasm, but of course we have to remember, Estonian and Latvian are really difficult to learn. I mean, if you were designing a complicated language for somebody to learn, especially coming from maybe not using the Latin alphabet, it's quite tricky. But certainly there's a great deal of enthusiasm for learning Estonian and Latvian. We've seen that in a huge take-up of classes. Again, volunteers in all three countries have been volunteering to teach their national languages to Ukrainian refugees. We also see that schools have opened up, so it's the young kids who learn the languages the fastest, of course. I mean, when I was small, in our house we spoke Latvian. I remember my first day at kindergarten. It was the worst day of my life. I was about 3 years old, and I didn't understand anything that was being said, right? In this town in England where I grew up, where my teacher was also Scottish, so there was a heavy Scottish accent to make it even more difficult for me. And I cried so loudly, they removed me from the classroom and made me sit by the stairs. But of course, as a kid, you learn quickly, and within a couple of weeks, I was at the top of the class in the Peter and Jane books we were using at that time. So the kids are learning very, very quickly, and of course they're returning home, homewards, they're helping their parents. And I think that things are progressing quite well here. It's a little bit tougher for college age people because undergraduate degrees are in the Baltic languages, which is normal in Europe, and then masters and PhDs tend to be in English. So there might be a generation of people there in the Baltics who are caught in a sort of no man's land, with there being just a few institutions teaching in English. As for day-to-day interactions, there's a lot of, let's say, oral evidence about conflicts sort of existing. We had a wonderful Ukrainian family stay with us last year after the war started, and Oksana would frequently comment that she was amazed by Russian speakers living in Latvia and how that they why haven't you integrated them, and so on and so on. And there does seem to be this sort of surprise, maybe some friction between these groups. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I tried.
Good enough, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm kind of curious, if I was sitting in Lithuania and they turned on my TV set, would I be watching Russian TV, Belarus TV?
No, not Russian or Belarusian. Lithuania actually has been quite quick. They were banning multiple pro-Kremlin television channels already prior to the war. But since the war, pretty much everything coming from Russia and Belarus has been banned. Now, of course, it's quite easy to get around that. You just need a VPN, and there are people who have no problems using this VPN. It's relatively cheap, isn't it? $10 for a year or something, and then you have access to these channels. But at least formally, if you're sitting at home and you're turning on your regular TV and not using a VPN, then no, you won't.
But I mean, the population like in Estonia and Latvia is like, what, 30, 40% Russian? Are they watching Russian TV?
No. Again, it's banned there, but there is Russian language programming, which comes from the public television. And there are these, let's say, the Kremlin opposition, the independent journalists, who typically have TV channels which are on YouTube or some other kind of like free to air or free to access thing. And you have this opportunity as well. I mean, this is one of the big debates in Baltic politics, of course, because if you ban Russian media, you should produce something yourself. As well, a public media. But then, should you use public resources to have Russian language programming? Well, it's a fraught political issue. But there is private media. There are also private media in the Baltic states which are targeting the Russian-speaking audiences, both written media and radios and so on.
I have a question about the economic ties to Russia. In terms of, it's one thing to ban media and change your schooling system, but what's the situation across the Baltics as far as the economies de-linking from connections with their eastern neighbor?
If you take away energy, it's almost unchanged. It's almost unchanged in terms of Baltic exports to Russia. Russian exports coming into the Baltics are down a little bit, but it's still a surprisingly large amount. I looked up this data last week and I was surprised that the fall was, I thought it would be sort of cut in half or something, and it wasn't even close to that. But the big transit in Latvia, for example, as you know, Martin, was the energy business, and that has mostly, but not entirely, stopped.
And have you noticed a change in the political discourse in terms of trying to find a replacement for that trade, looking westward instead?
Yeah, well, this is the hope is that we can find new markets in the West, but really that doesn't help the transit business very much, because transit is not an endpoint; it's stuff going through, and so there will have to be new jobs created in the rail system, in around the ports, and unfortunately, the biggest job losses are in those places which have the highest unemployment. So, for instance, Daugavpils has long been a rail hub. But because of a cut in the transit with Russia, many jobs have been lost. And in Daugavpils, it's very, very difficult to try to persuade an international investor to go to Daugavpils. Not impossible, but very, very difficult. So it will be hard to find employment there. Please.
When you are walking around downtown Riga, are you hearing people speaking in Russian still, or do you a lot? As
Yes.
it was before?
Yes. You still, I would say there's no change in people's personal habits in terms of the language that they speak to within their family or within their friends. A change that may have taken place, but again, this is anecdotal evidence, is cross-language conversation. So Latvians and to a lesser extent Estonians, but also the complaint has been heard there, that when speaking to a Russian, they switch to the Russian language. And anecdotally, it seems that that is happening less frequently. And certainly, as we've seen, the legal basis for it, to communicate in Latvian in a shop, in a restaurant, and so on, is there now, or an EU language, but not Russian.
Yes, thank you for your talk. If I was understanding your presentation, I think you described some steps to encourage the Russian minorities to assimilate into the native Baltic cultures, and these cultures are Western cultures. Currently, what percentage of the Russian minorities do you think have actually assimilated? And let me also add another comment. The United States is actually moving in the opposite direction of Baltic states. We no longer expect non-Western immigrants to assimilate to Western culture, and by the year, I believe 2045, the dominant culture will no longer be Western. We will not be a Western nation anymore.
It's hard to give some concrete data on the assimilation. I would probably return to those school numbers. And if there are 28% in the previous school year, students were studying in minority schools, then that would probably be indicative of a lack of integration, I would say, because of the negative repercussions in terms of continuing your education in a public university and having limited opportunities to work in a public sphere and diplomacy and all these other things because you don't have it. So I would say about 28%. And the logic for the Baltic states is, one, it's written into the constitutions of each country that this is a place where the Latvian language is spoken, the Estonian, the Lithuanian, these are the only places in the world where these languages are spoken, and so they need to be protected. And then that's the logic for having the legislation protecting these languages in place.
Is there any overlay to religious orientation that affects assimilation that you've seen there?
Broadly speaking, I would say no, because if we're talking about the Orthodox Church here, then we have the Old Believers, who have been living in Latvia for hundreds and hundreds of years, and which are largely integrated, both in the Eastern Latgale region and wherever else they are in Latvia, mostly concentrated in Latgale. Religion is not that big an issue in the Baltic states. We're sort of, as you know, we're sort of post-church. We don't really believe anymore. I mean, Estonia and Latvia are famous as having the lowest numbers of people connected to the Christian church, and so on. Very low levels of people attending church at least once a month or undergoing religious instruction. So really, the religious thing is not I would say, a divider.
Thank you.
I'm curious why it took so long for the Baltic states to switch the language. I'm originally from Ukraine, from the Russian-speaking part, Lugansk, and I studied at Kyiv University the year Soviet Union broke up. And all of a sudden, the coup happened at the end of June, right? September 1st, we were like, congratulations, you're the elite of new Ukraine, and all the education is going to be in Ukrainian. TV channels followed. And yes, for a while you could still hear people conversing on the streets, but as the generation went from kindergarten, preschool, through university, then like 10, 15 years later, all of a sudden you hear people conversing on the streets in Ukrainian. And I hear your comment about, the push from EU, but I would imagine in 91, the push was still not there, and clearly Ukraine had probably higher percent of Russian-speaking population than Baltic states. Why was there such a difference?
Well, I'm not sure the percentage was in Ukraine. In Latvia, Latvians in Latvia in 1991 were 52% of the population, and of the 48% of the minorities, Russian speakers around 36%. So very large, significant minority numbers. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, at that time, the EU was, an unimagined thing. It would be like, Latvia becoming the 51st state or something. Something some of us only dream about at the moment. But I think really it was a sort of path dependency thing. So, I mean, the coup was August the 23rd, I think. And then school year starts on the 1st of September. So you don't really have time to change stuff. And then you have the issues which are still around today. Well, who's going to do the teaching? So I mean, we don't have enough Latvian teachers capable of speaking Latvian to go around. So what do? Do we double the class sizes and these kind of things? And then of course you need the literature and all these other things. And of course there was a dreadful and deep economic crisis in the early 1990s when income collapsed. Very very few taxes were collected and so on. And there just wasn't money to print hundreds of thousands or millions of new textbooks. And also you have to write them and all these other things. So to begin with, it was this. A year later, there are other concerns. I mean, let's remember that the Russian army, renamed after the collapse from Soviet to Russian, had a presence in all three Baltic states, an ominous physical presence. Where the Latvian Ministry of Defense is now, bang in the middle of town, that used to be the HQ for the Russian military in Latvia. And this was a very ominous presence there that kind of says, well, you know, are we really going to, you know, switch to Latvian language while we have thousands and thousands of armed, perhaps incompetent, but still armed young Russian soldiers in our countries. So the Russian troops withdrew in the mid-1990s, but by then there was already this track sort of going to the EU. We had, for those that some of you might remember, Max van der Stoel from the 1990s, who was the OSCE's commissioner for minorities, who would come to the Baltic states and tell them that you can't do this, you can't take away language rights, you have to give citizenship, and so on and so on. And by then, I think the conditionality paradigm was in place.
Makes sense. It's probably also Ukrainian is not as different from Russian as Latvian and Estonian. So it's, yeah, the professors were stumbling and there were no books for like a year and a half, but it's still easier to switch to Latvian.
What did happen was higher education switched really, really quickly. By 1993, when I started living in Latvia, working at the university, there was no teaching in Russian. And there may have been some courses that were just at the end of the cycle, but there were no new students being enrolled in the Russian language.
I ask two questions. One is about rethinking the closure of the Dorsch. There was a big uproar when it happened, and it, at least from here, it looked a bit abrupt. Any rethinking of this episode? That is one. And second, are there any signs of wariness of the support of Ukraine, especially from business communities who are looking to the day after? And that's going back to the questions that was asked earlier. We see some signs of it, worrying signs in Europe, Germany, France, Italy. What is the state of the Baltics, or the fear of the Russians overwhelms everything else?
Okay, so first of all, TV Rain, or Dost, as you called it. In actual fact, this was a drama that played out over many months in Latvia. So there was this final turning point, but it had sort of broken regulations at various points. There had been several Twitter storms where people had pointed out, that Dost had, a journalist had called, the troops our boys and this. And it already by then, within Latvia, had a reputation, let's say, not a crystal clean reputation. So by the time that the decision was made, there was very little opposition. Some more liberal-minded NGOs, certainly the Latvian Journalists Association, which is also famously liberal, also spoke out against it. But amongst the general population, I think, they supported this very political move to get rid of Dost. And as for the fatigue, well, this is a really good question. I mean, the only evidence we really have is elections. And on the 1st of October last year, we had the parliamentary election in Latvia, and the Prime Minister, whose party was 3rd or 4th in the polls in January, before the war broke out, was returned with 4 times more seats, I think, than they had in the previous parliament. By far the biggest political party. And pro-Ukraine political parties were elected to the parliament. Only one small political party, known as Stability, which is it just about keeps within the bounds of saying the acceptable without coming out in favor of Russia. In the war, they do the famous thing that, we're for peace. We're not for either side. Well, you kind of are if you say that. So Stability is the only one, which you could call perhaps a pro-Kremlin one. There's another one, Latvia First, which is sort of modeled on the Donald Trump Republican Party, which is also a little bit like this, but they mostly talk about economics. They say, look, we don't need the economic hit, so they try to stay away from the politics. But otherwise, all the other deputies are very much pro-Ukraine. So the government that was returned continued the policies they had begun. And of course, exactly the same is true in Estonia, where Kaja Kallas was returned with a bigger majority for her political party, and she was able to put together a coalition to pretty much exactly carry on the politics as before. So if we look at elections and election outcomes, the publics in the Baltic states seem to support these policies, and there's no visible fatigue. I mean, after all, for the Baltic states, it's really an existential issue. You know, they can't have Ukraine lose. Ukraine must win or be seen to win the conflict. For Denmark, for Portugal, these issues are not as immediate.
I'd like you to speculate.
Oh.
So after Ukraine wins the war, what about the Ukrainian refugees in the Baltic states? Speculate about how many were going to return to Ukraine versus stay in the countries, because they just learned the language.
Yeah, well, it's not just about the language. It's also
And
about
about jobs, maybe.
Yeah, it's also about the income. This is a
Oh.
really good question, and if you want more details, I would point you towards the Estonian Parliament.
That's
Sounds
fine.
terribly boring, doesn't it? But the Estonian Parliament has what's called a foresight think tank. And they actually published a piece of research about this where they tried to estimate what would happen with the Ukrainian refugees, the 40,000 some refugees in Estonia, over the next 10 years, on the principle that Ukraine wins the war. And basically the assumption is that a great many, without putting a specific figure on it, a great many will return, but many will stay because of the economic differences. It's the same as the huge depopulation that Latvia and Lithuania have experienced over the last 20 years, especially after joining the European Union. When you have free movement, when you have free movement, and you have the Mexico and the U.S. isn't a good example.
We've all heard about the Poles who went to Britain to be plumbers.
Yeah, 120,000 Latvians also in the UK at the moment. But when you have free movement and you have let's say countries with a GDP or annual income per capita of Uruguay, and it becomes a 51st state, of course you would expect people to move in search of work, especially when the economic crisis hit. And a great many have stayed, proved to be much stickier than had been initially thought. And I think exactly the same will be true for Ukrainian refugees. For the case of Latvia and Lithuania, nowhere near to half of those people that have left over the last 20 years have returned. It's a fraction. We don't know exactly how much, but it's a fraction that have returned. And with Ukraine, it's slightly different because it's not they're not economic refugees or economic migrants, they're war migrants, but inevitably some will stick. And once Ukraine's in the EU, then you would expect even more free movement.
Thank you.
Is it easy to become a citizen?
Sorry?
Is it easy to become a citizen?
In Latvia?
Latvia.
Yeah, you need to have residency for a set period of time. I forget how many, whether it's 3 years or 5 years. You have to take a very simple test, like the one in the US, the Constitution, the flag, that kind of thing, the history, and you need to pass a language test. And those are the three things. But if you're referring to why Russian speakers maybe haven't done this, these the ones who are Russian citizens primarily did it because they didn't want to do the test, and because they thought they would have greater benefits from having Russian citizenship. That they can still travel for free on transport in Riga, for example, even if you're a pensioner of a different country, in this case Russia. So they don't lose their right to ride on a trolley bus for free, but they don't have to buy a visa every time they enter Russia to visit their cousin, which they might do several times a year. So it was really probably a financial calculation.
I don't know, any more questions? Please join me in thanking our